Hello, dreamers, and welcome to this 209th episode of California Dreaming. For those of you who are not in our Facebook discussion group, I am taking a little bit of time away from the regular in-depth episodes of California Dreaming for the next few weeks to focus on a script that I'm in the middle of writing for the My Dark Path podcast hosted by MF Thomas. Some of you have taken a chance on the show, and I've heard nothing but wonderful feedback from those of you who've listened, and I'm really proud to be a part of his brilliant team of writers. As for Patreon, I will have the next episode of our Fire and Wine series for the month of November available very soon, so be on the lookout for that. And speaking of Patreon, if you would like to access hours and hours of exclusive content, you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month. This week, I'd like to thank Jerry S., DZ, Trina C., Sam G., Stephen B., and Camilla H. for either joining Patreon or raising their pledge to the next tier. If you would like to contribute to the production of this podcast but aren't interested in a subscription or extra episodes, you can make a one-time donation to the show through my email, californiapod@gmail.com. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. The Tale of the Duffy Street Catastrophes. The backdrop of today's story is the city of San Bernardino, California. Obviously, it's located in the county of San Bernardino. It is the largest county in the 48 contiguous United States, stretching from approximately an hour east of Los Angeles all the way to the western border of Nevada and the northwestern border of Arizona. The city of San Bernardino sits at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, east of the San Bernardino Valley, 60 miles or 97 kilometers east of downtown Los Angeles. It's about 20 minutes south of the Cajon Pass, which is the section of Interstate 15 that gets you over the San Bernardino Mountain summit, which is 4,268 feet or 1,300 meters above sea level, and it serves as the main gateway between Southern California and Las Vegas, Nevada. If you've ever driven the Cajon Pass, you may have caught a glimpse of dozens and dozens of freight cars slowly making their way along the Union Pacific Railroad. If this train is traveling from east to west, it's the city of San Bernardino that is at the base of the summit from which this train has descended. And at the bottom of the descent, the railroad tracks make a 4-degree curve. And along that curve are a cluster of homes lined up alongside those tracks on Duffy Street. It is that neighborhood where our story will be taking us on a beautiful late spring Southern California day back in 1989. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, May 12, 1989, Southern Pacific Freight Train number 7551 East was waiting along a railroad siding in the Mojave Desert, staged and ready to make its way west over the San Gabriel Mountains through the Cajon Pass. A railroad siding, in case you aren't familiar, is a section of tracks that are meant only for low-speed trains that branch off and reconnect back onto the main line of tracks, which is called a loop. There are sidings that only branch off the main tracks and do not loop back onto the main tracks, and those are called single-ended or dead-ended sidings. The chief engineer on the Southern Pacific train that morning was 33-year-old Frank Holland. As the engineer, it's his job to operate the locomotives, control the speed at which the train is traveling, ensure the train slows down as needed at any restrictions along the way, and ensure that the train arrives safely at its destination. Frank's work for this trip actually started the evening before, on Thursday, May 11th, at the Mojave Desert Rail Yard. Rail yards are located at specific areas along a railroad's main line and consist of a complex array of tracks that are used for arranging, grouping, organizing, sequencing, loading, and unloading freight cars and locomotives. Rail yards have many sets of parallel tracks that are used to keep or store freight cars, flat cars, and unused locomotives so they don't get in the way of the flow of railroad traffic. Southern Pacific picks up crew members and additional freight cars and locomotives as needed as the train makes its way across the United States. Frank arrived at the rail yard and went into the office to pick up the paperwork associated with everything that he was picking up from the Mojave rail yard. The paperwork, among other things, includes the train's tonnage profile, which is the total weight of everything, freight, loaded cars, empty cars, as well as the length of the train. So it has the weight of everything that's being pulled by the locomotives and anything that is not providing any power in propelling the train, but it doesn't include the weight of the locomotives themselves. The paperwork Frank is given shows that he will be pulling 69 freight cars, and they are all loaded with trona. Trona is a non-toxic chemical component that has a number of uses, including as being a component of fertilizer, manufacturing glass, paper, detergents, textiles. It's used to condition water, to remove sulfur from gases and coals, and it is also used as a food additive. There are 2 trona mines in California, one at Owens Lake and one at Searles Lake. Owens Lake is mostly dry and located in the Owens Valley on the east side of the Sierra Nevada in Inyo County, California. Searles Lake, also dry, is located in the Mojave Desert in northwestern San Bernardino County. Anyway, with the information on this paperwork that includes the weight of all the cargo, it's Frank's job to figure out how much horsepower he's going to need in order to get this freight over the mountain, as well as the speed that he will need to be traveling as the train goes down the mountain, and to ensure that he has the braking power to hold that safe speed. According to what is listed on his paperwork, Frank sees that he will be hauling 7.7 million pounds or 3.5 million kilograms of cargo. Ultimately, the freight is going to end up in South America, but Frank is only taking it as far as Colton, California, which is just a few minutes south of the city of San Bernardino. So Frank is responsible for getting the freight over the mountain, through the pass, and carefully slowing the train through the downgrade. Sitting up in the lead engine with Frank will be Southern Pacific's number 7551's conductor, 35-year-old Everett Crown. His job is to provide assistance to Frank. 43-year-old Alan Reese was the brakeman on the 3rd locomotive, Southern Pacific number 7549. Frank, Everett, and Alan, they all have approximately 50 years of total experience between them working for Southern Pacific. In order to make sure that he has enough horsepower to make it over the mountain pass, Frank requested more engines for this trip. Dispatchers with Southern Pacific assigned 2 additional helper locomotives that will be attached on the back end of the 69 freight cars. The engineer in the back on Southern Pacific number 7433 was 42-year-old Lawrence Hill, and his brakeman was 57-year-old Robert Waterbury. Lawrence and Robert have worked this route in the past, but it isn't where they normally are sent to work. They were unaware of the weight of the cargo that they were going to haul, and for whatever reason, they didn't ask. Frank Holland had that information, and I can only presume that they thought that they were on a need-to-know basis. So with the addition of 2 more locomotives on the end, Southern Pacific 7551 East has a total of 6 engines, 4 in the front with Frank, Everett, and Allen, and 2 in the back with Lawrence and Robert. That's a total of 5 crew members. Once the back two engines are ready and everything is coupled together, the engineer in the back contacted the engineer in the front to let them know that they were set and ready to go. And with that, the train begins its journey, slowly picking up speed as it goes. It will reach the Cajon Pass summit in approximately 90 minutes. Meanwhile, down at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, the sun is rising and the residents of San Bernardino are beginning to wake up and start their day. It's Friday and it's Mother's Day weekend. Duffy Street, situated next to the Southern Pacific train tracks, is a modest neighborhood made up of single-family homes. While the residents enjoy the family-oriented area, one of the downsides of the location is the railroad tracks. Trains rumble by on top of a 20-foot or 6-meter high levee, and some of the houses on Duffy Street are backed right up against the tracks. So when a train rumbles by, the houses rumble right along with them. Personally, I've never lived near a train track. I don't think my parents would have ever bought a house near one. The drawbacks, of course, obviously, is the noise and the vibrations that are caused as the train passes by. Home values are usually lower when located near train tracks, and there is often other related traffic issues because of the trains. There are some who like the sound of a train that slowly passes by, but the noise and vibrations increase if that train is traveling fast. Then there is the loud sound of the conductor blowing the horn at intersections. The warning horn is usually blasted several times over the course of the day. And if the train happens to be applying its brakes, you will hear the sound of the wheels squealing and screeching until it all comes to a stop. All of these sounds can affect those who perhaps need to nap during the day, like people who work at night or even young children. And it has an adverse effect on people who may be migraine sufferers. Sound reduction windows might help, but not if you want the windows to be open for fresh air. Trains may also pollute the air and have an effect on those who suffer from allergies and asthma. One of the few upsides of a home near train tracks, if you're looking to purchase, is that the price may be substantially lower and more affordable than comparable houses not near train tracks. Rents may also be cheaper, so it's a trade-off one would have to consider when thinking of either renting or buying a home near tracks. However, when it comes to commuter trains, the opposite may be the case. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research in Fremont, California, found sale prices for homes increased 9 to 15% in houses that were 2 miles away from commuter trains compared to those located further away. Getting back to our story, shortly after 7 in the morning on that Friday, Southern Pacific train number 7551 reached the highest point of its journey through the Cajon Pass. From that point forward, the rest of the trip is all downhill. The Cajon Pass is a vital link between Southern California and basically the rest of the United States, as it is only one of 3 ways to get through the San Gabriel Mountains, and it is the busiest, both by train or by way of the 15, which I mentioned earlier, that connects Southern California to Vegas and everything beyond that. The engineers, conductors, and crew that regularly travel through the mountain passes are highly respected and regarded in the industry because it is more demanding and taxing as opposed to traveling across flat lands. The Cajon Pass is considered one of the most difficult mountain passes in the United States for railroad engineers and conductors to get through. It is exceptionally challenging and everyone has to be sharp, present, and focused at all times. I've only ever driven up and down the Cajon Pass more times than I could ever count, as many of my fellow Southern Californians have. Heading towards Vegas, it's not all that bad, but it's coming back down from Vegas that makes me nervous. It's a very steep downgrade, and some drivers like to let gravity take their cars downhill so fast and I am certainly not one of them. I am on my brakes a lot, and more so as I've gotten older, I'm sure. So anyway, as 7551 reached the summit, everything was going just fine. They were on schedule, they were making good time, and the engineering conductor at the front had not had any communication with the engineer in the back since they left the Mojave rail yard because there was no reason to. They didn't have any problems or issues that needed to be addressed. When they reach the summit, they've also reached the most crucial part of this trip, and that is slowing the train down that is carrying its massive freight as it begins going down the mountain. As it starts its descent, what the crew don't realize is that they have already lost control of this train. They just aren't aware of it quite yet. Soon, they will find that they'll be unable to slow this train down as it gradually picks up speed while barreling towards that quiet neighborhood on Duffy Street in the city of San Bernardino. When the train begins heading downhill, lead engineer Frank Holland applied his dynamic brakes. These brakes will slow all the locomotives, which will begin to slow down the speed of the entire train. Dynamic braking uses an electric traction motor as a generator when slowing the locomotive and reduces wear on friction based on braking systems and lowers the engine's net energy consumption. The maximum speed going through the pass allowed for this train, with the number of freight cars and total weight that it is carrying, is 30 miles or 48 kilometers per hour. Next, Frank makes contact with the helper engineer in the back, Lawrence Hill, to make sure he is able to maintain his speed. Lawrence confirms that he has engaged his dynamic brakes and is able to keep his speed at the limit. The first section of tracks during the downhill run has a total of 56 turns to the left and to the right. The friction caused by these turns helps to slow down the speed of the train along with the dynamic brakes. However, even with the dynamic brakes and the turn friction, Frank begins to apply the train's air brakes. In an air brake system, compressed air pushes a piston in a cylinder. The piston is connected through a mechanical link in the brake shoes that rub on the train wheels, with the friction causing the train to slow down. The pressurized air comes from an air compressor in the locomotive and is sent to every single freight car through a brake line beneath and hoses between each car. So all 69 freight cars' brakes should be applied when Frank engages the air brakes. At this point, the train was traveling at 25 miles or 40 kilometers per hour, which is the speed that Frank wants the train to be going at this point in time, and he wants to maintain that speed for the rest of the way down this mountain. However, once they've gotten past the 56 turns, lead conductor Everett Crown notices that the train is continuing to pick up speed. They reach 30 miles or 48 kilometers per hour. Frank looked at the speedometer and saw that the increase in speed wasn't huge, but they've now reached the maximum speed limit that they should be traveling going downhill, and they still had quite a ways to go yet. As he kept glancing back at the speedometer, the speed of the train was still slowly creeping up. With both the dynamic brakes and the air brakes being applied, along with the friction from the 56 turns in the track, the speed should not have been increasing at all. It should have maintained a steady speed, if nothing else. The crew in the front locomotives were slightly confused and concerned with this uptick in speed. So Frank went ahead and increased the air pressure flowing through the air braking system. Despite this, the train continued picking up speed. As the train reached a speed of 40 miles or 64 kilometers per hour, the crew became more concerned. With the brakes engaged, the speed of the train should not have been increasing at the rate that it was, and it was traveling faster than they were allowed to be going along this stretch of the railway. Within minutes, as the train raced downhill, it reached a speed of 45 miles or 72 kilometers an hour. Lead engineer Frank turned the pressure on the air brakes as high as it would go. But still, it did nothing to slow the train down. Frank and Everett knew that once the train reached the foot of the mountain and it entered into the city of San Bernardino, the tracks bend, and the maximum speed the train is allowed to make at that turn is 40 miles or 64 kilometers an hour. They are only part way down the mountain, and this train is traveling much faster than that, and it's steadily picking up speed with no signs that there is anything that they are doing that will slow it down. Frank has been up and down this route enough times to know that once he hits that turn at the bottom of the downgrade, there is a street with several homes that would be directly in the path of the train should it go off the rails. And he knew at the speed that they would be traveling once they got to that turn, there was no way that this train wouldn't derail. In the locomotives at the back, helper engineer Lawrence Hill had also become aware that their train is traveling at a dangerous speed. He knew that the air pressure brakes had been turned up to full, yet they were not slowing down. He told his brakeman, Robert Waterbury, that there must be something wrong going on up at the front. However, he doesn't pick up his phone and call Frank and Everett up at the front, but instead, he goes ahead and turns on the train's emergency brakes, which is a completely separate mechanism from the train's conventional brake systems, and it's designed to stop the train as quickly as possible. That was their last hope of slowing this train down. And for a brief moment, the emergency brakes do cause everyone to suddenly jolt forward, the same way you would in a car when somebody suddenly slams on the brakes. Frank and Everett lurched forward, but it only lasted a few seconds. The train went back immediately to steadily gaining speed despite all three braking systems being applied. In fact, according to Frank, the speed began increasing so quickly, it was something that he had never seen or experienced before. In all the times that he had gone up and down the Cajon Pass, this was the first time he was unable to slow his train down. The brakes weren't working, the speed was getting faster and faster, and soon the friction from the failing brakes began to cause smoke to come pouring out from underneath the train. Within minutes, the crew was powerless to do anything but watch the speedometer as it reached 60 miles or 96 kilometers an hour, and soon 70 miles or 112 kilometers, 80 miles or 128 kilometers. The highest speed the speedometer would read was 90 miles or 145 kilometers per hour. They just weren't meant to reach these speeds ever. But they haven't even finished going down the mountain yet, and the train is only going to continue to gain speed until it doesn't. As Frank Holland's freight train is now flying down the Cajon Pass, his mind is going back through everything that he did to prepare for this trip, wondering where it went wrong, where he went wrong, what mistakes he made, what in the world did he overlook. He's the engineer. The imminent disaster that they are about to face, the responsibility for it all, is on his shoulders. He attempted to contact dispatch ahead at the Colton station where they were scheduled to stop, but nobody answered their call. This would have been their chance to inform them of the out-of-control train barreling down the mountain pass, but nobody picked up. Is there anything that could have been done if somebody had? Perhaps there may have been some sort of protocols in place. If they would have been able to have radioed and gotten through to the Colton Station terminal, Maybe they would have been able to call police or the fire department. They know where the train is going to derail. There could have been an emergency evacuation initiated. I don't know how effective that would have been, or if there would have even been enough time. There have been plenty of disasters, natural and otherwise, where there was a certain amount of advance notice, but tragedy was not averted. This was 1989. There weren't cell phones all over the place. And this runaway train thing, it's not something that happens every day. But trains and the railroad systems had been around for 100 years before cars started becoming the more popular way to get around. So by 1989, there was a way to get a warning out there when it came to a runaway train. But you had to answer the call. Well, eventually, dispatch at the Colton terminal picked up the radio call. Frank told them that the train was speeding out of control down the Cajon Pass, that they had no way of slowing it down or stopping, and eventually they began radioing it as a mayday. But apparently there wasn't anything that anyone could do at that point. The train was going to reach at least 100 miles or 160 kilometers an hour. So all they can do on the train is brace themselves and wait. Even if there was anything the Colton terminal could have done to initiate an evacuation at the point where they knew the train would derail, it was too late. The residents on Duffy Street are accustomed to the sound and the feel of freight trains headed their way. But on this particular morning, the houses and windows of their homes were rattling more than usual, to a point where some residents thought that their windows were on the verge of shattering. As the freight train drew closer, the shaking intensified. As the train approached the turn next to the Duffy Street neighborhood, Frank turned to Everett and said, "We're about to die on that turn." He could see the fear in Everett's eyes, and Frank was certain he looked the same. Both of them sat in a complete state of terror, but at the same time, in a state of disbelief that this was actually happening, that they were facing their last moments on Earth. This was it. All Frank could tell Everett was to brace himself and hang on. I've binged a lot of airplane disasters in the past couple of months on YouTube, and Frank seemed to be doing the same thing that the passengers and crew do on airplanes when they're about to brace for impact. Any which way that he could in the cab of his locomotive. There was one thing that Frank Holland was certain of. He was not going to come out of this alive. At 7:36 a.m., Southern Pacific Railway's train number 7551 East derailed into the section of Duffy Street that was adjacent to the railroad tracks. The 4 locomotives in the front, the 69 freight cars, and 2 locomotives in the back were completely demolished. 7 homes were also destroyed, and 4 additional homes were extensively damaged. Of the 5 crew members on board the train, 35-year-old conductor in the front engine Everett Crown and 43-year-old brakeman Alan Reese on the third engine were both crushed to death in the crash. Lead engineer 33-year-old Frank Holland had remained in his seat in the control stand and suffered a number of cracked ribs and a punctured lung, but he survived. The engine had turned onto its side, but he managed to crawl out of it with the help of a bystander. Helper engineer 42-year-old Lawrence Hill and helper brakeman 57-year-old Robert Waterbury, who were in one of the locomotives in the back, both survived with minor injuries. 8 residents on Duffy Street were at home at the time of the derailment. 2 of them, children, were killed. 7-year-old Jason Thompson and 9-year-old Tyson White. One resident, 24-year-old Christopher Shaw, was missing and trapped somewhere underneath all of the debris. Remaining residents were subsequently evacuated from the surrounding area due to a concern that a 14-inch high-pressure petroleum transit pipeline owned by the CalNev pipeline company, which transported gasoline 6 feet or almost 2 meters underground directly below the site of the derailment, may have sustained damage or could possibly be damaged during the course of the cleanup efforts. If there was any part of this pipeline that had been damaged, and if any bit of gasoline was leaking, it could very easily be ignited, causing a catastrophic explosion. Before the derailment, residents had no idea that there was a gasoline pipeline running just a few feet underground directly behind their homes. CalNev quickly removed several hundred barrels of fuel from the pipe in order to reduce the size of any potential explosion, but there was still a large amount of fuel in the pipeline that was under a tremendous amount of pressure. There are a number of automatic safety valves located along the pipeline that are intended to shut off individual sections of the pipe that were not functioning properly at that time, so CalNev was unable to completely drain all of the fuel located in the pipeline directly underneath the train derailment. So that was a hazard that everyone had to continue to deal with. By 11 a.m., the 2 children killed in one of the demolished homes were pulled from the wreckage, but the one person missing had yet to be found. CalNev pipeline officials were unable to inspect the pipeline for damage until all of the rail cars and debris were removed, but that can't be completed until the missing person was found. As the hours ticked by, firefighters were beginning to think that they were looking to recover a body, not a live person, but they continued to search in shifts. Christopher Shaw's home had been completely destroyed by the train derailment, but his mom was on site and was able to draw a rudimentary map of the layout of the home and told searchers that her son was in the bathroom at the time of the accident. Firefighters then focused their search on the area where the bathroom would have been located, and Christopher was finally discovered alive, buried under debris, shortly after 9 p.m. that night, close to 14 hours after the accident, and it took almost another 2 hours to pull him from the wreckage. CalNev pipeline officials stayed on site to ensure the safe cleanup and removal of the rail cars and to check for damage to the pipeline. Residents were allowed back in their homes within 24 hours, and railroad service where the derailment took place was restored 4 days after the accident. In total, 4 people were killed, 2 crew members on the train, and 2 residents, both children in the neighborhood. 4 people were injured, and 7 homes were demolished. Even with the threat of a possible gasoline pipeline ignition and explosion, the cleanup effort continued, as did the investigation into the cause of the derailment, which was being conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB. Even several hours after the derailment, investigators could see that the metal wheels from the rail cars were still incredibly hot due to the friction caused by the brakes. They'd gotten so hot that the metal expanded to a point where the wheels had popped off their axles, and the friction caused between the wheels, the brakes, and the tracks had become so extreme that the wheels had begun to liquefy, meaning as this train raced down that mountain pass, they were turning into molten steel. Obviously, the brakes weren't slowing down the train. What the NTSB needed to figure out was why. The next day, Southern Pacific Railways was responsible for clearing out all of their cars so that CalNev could get to the pipeline to see if it sustained any damage. It took 2 days for all the rail cars to be cleared out, but countless tons of trona were still spilled all over the place. While bulldozers worked to move as much of the trona out of the way as they could, CalNev pipeline employees worked on clearing the trona away from the area above their pipeline using shovels so that they could finally get to the pipe to inspect it. They did not want the heavy machinery getting too close to the pipe, as it may cause it some damage. CalNev safety inspectors excavated down to the pipe and visually inspected it for any leaks or damage. The fuel inside the pipe is under a tremendous amount of pressure, so a leak would be easily noticed, but it would also become a massive leak very quickly with a high risk of explosion. From all that the CalNev employees could see from their inspection, the pipe appeared to sustain no damage. Being buried underground at the depth that it was protected it from being damaged by all of the destruction caused from the train derailment. The CalNev pipeline that runs underground is an essential source of gasoline for the city of Las Vegas and the surrounding communities, as well as the military. So there was a great deal of urgency for the pipeline company to get this gasoline flowing again to eliminate shortages. But residents whose homes survived the derailment were very uncomfortable with the rush to get the fuel going again. One Duffy Street resident claimed that Las Vegans were complaining about the limited gasoline supplies, saying that they own cars worth more than any house on Duffy Street. I don't know if that actually happened. That was just the word of one resident. It seems like it would have been a pretty petty thing to be saying in the wake of such a disaster. But there may very well have been some conflict between the residents who didn't want a potentially compromised gas line to be put back into use too soon, and millions of gasoline customers who were experiencing fuel shortages. 4 days after the derailment, on the same day that Southern Pacific finished up repairs to the tracks and trains began traveling along the line once again, the CalNev pipeline was back up and running at its full capacity. CalNev pipeline officials kept a close eye on any sign if there was a drop in the pipeline's pressure, which would have been an indication that fuel was escaping from somewhere, that the system had some kind of leak. But as far as they could see, the pipeline pressure remained steady. Even though Southern Pacific's rail line was back in business, as was the gasoline pipeline after only 4 days following the derailment, the trona, which is a substance that has the consistency of ash, was still strewn about the area. Heavy machinery was still coming in and out of the area to clean up the remaining trona, loading it into trucks so it could be hauled away. The pipeline, which could have been damaged by all of the heavy equipment, was marked above ground by a series of wooden stakes. Duffy Street residents had been assured by CalNev representatives that the pipeline had been thoroughly inspected, they've been monitoring the pressure, and that they were confident that there were no leaks or compromises in the pipeline, though some of the residents reported the smell of gas. CalNev was confident that their pipeline was safe. The NTSB remained at the derailment site until the cleanup was finished. The area was surrounded by a chain link fence, and everybody felt that everything was secure. At 8:05 a.m. on Thursday, May 25th, 1989, 13 days after the Southern Pacific train derailment, the 14-inch CalNev pressurized transit gasoline pipeline ruptured at the site of the derailment. Liquid began spewing up from the ground, similar to how a fire hydrant that'd been sheared off by a car would spew water into the air. But this was not water that was cascading all over the lawns, homes, and cars along Duffy Street. It was gasoline. And within minutes, that gasoline ignited and exploded. 2 more residents were killed. They were burned to death. I searched online through the NTSB report, newspaper articles, anything that I can find on this story, but I was unable to find the names or ages of those 2 victims. 3 people were seriously injured. 16 people sustained minor injuries. 11 more homes were destroyed. 3 homes had moderate fire and smoke damage, and 3 more homes sustained smoke damage only. 21 vehicles were destroyed, and residents within a 4-block radius of the explosion were evacuated by local officials. The total damage from the train derailment and the pipeline explosion came to roughly $14 million. When I put that into the inflation calculator, that would be about $31.2 million today. Many of the same firefighters that were called to the train derailment 13 days earlier were called back for yet another catastrophe on Duffy Street. As they raced towards the site of the explosion, they could see the enormous plume of black smoke and flames billowing more than 300 feet or 100 meters into the sky. Firefighters knew what they were looking at. They knew that this was a gasoline explosion, and they knew it was the CalNev pipeline that caused it. When fire engines arrived, the heat emanating from the explosion was so intense that the various lights and turn signal lenses on their fire trucks melted away. The fire was continuing to be fed by the fuel gushing out of the ruptured pipe at a very high pressure, and the sound it was making was similar to the sound of a very low-flying commercial jetliner. This fire burned for 7 hours, being fed by gasoline spewing out of the rupture, and firefighters battled it the entire time. And the same NTSB officials that were there 13 days earlier were also ordered back to the scene at Duffy Street. And just like 13 days earlier when that freight train derailed, CalNev was unable to close any of their emergency safety valves to stop the high-pressure fuel from flowing out of this breach in their pipeline. In the 7 hours that this fire burned, almost 530,000 gallons or 2 million liters of gasoline burned. So what was to account for all of this death and destruction from 2 back-to-back disasters 13 days apart? The cause, investigators will discover, was a dreadfully simple mistake. Human error. When it came to the train derailment, NTSB investigators were able to get useful information from the black boxes that were recovered from 3 out of the 6 locomotives. Similar to black boxes on airplanes, these event recorders account for the distance traveled, speed, throttle position, air brake pressure, among other data. They had to estimate the speed that the train had actually reached when it derailed because it had exceeded what could be recorded and graphed by the data recorders. Based on information from the black box and investigators' best estimates, the train had reached approximately 110 miles or 177 kilometers per hour before it derailed. They could tell from the data recorders that the train continued to accelerate despite the brakes being applied. The Southern Pacific train that derailed had the 2 braking systems that I detailed earlier, dynamic brakes and air brakes. The investigation revealed that the air brakes were working properly as the train began its descent down the mountain pass. However, as the train continued downhill, lead engineer Frank Holland maintained the pressure on the air brakes. But the heat created by the friction caused the brakes and the wheels of the rail cars to become so extreme that the brakes melted, and by the time the train derailed, the air brakes were completely inoperative. So then the NTSB examined the train's dynamic braking system. This braking system harnesses a magnetic field that is created by the locomotive's generator. The dynamic brake reverses this magnetic field, and this in turn slows down the axles on the engines. In all, there were 4 engines in the front of the train and 2 in the back, 6 in total. Before the start of this trip, lead engineer Frank Holland was aware that the second engine's brakes were not working at all, and that the dynamic brakes on engine number 4 only worked intermittently. But based on the information that he had about his freight and his cargo, the functioning engines and brakes that he did have were plenty. In addition to that, he was given 2 more helper engines in the back, so keeping the train at or below 30 miles or 48 kilometers per hour as they went down the mountain would not have been a problem at all. But once he got started down the mountain and past the 56 turns that assisted in slowing the train down, Frank soon realized that he wasn't able to maintain that safe rate of speed at all. The NTSB investigators discovered from the data recorders that the brakes on the train's third engine were not working at all either. So of the 4 engines in the front, the brakes were only working on engine number 1 and sporadically on engine number 4. Engines 2 and 3 were completely useless in helping to slow the freight train down. Brakeman Alan Reese was in the third engine, and engineer Frank Holland had even called back to Alan at one point during the trip to see if everything was working well in the third engine, and he assured him that all was working. But the data recorder showed that the dynamic brakes were being applied in engine 3 and making the noise that they usually made when they were applied, but they were not working and they were not helping to slow the train down. And when it came to the 2 engines that were coupled onto the back of the train, one of them had no functioning brakes at all. Lawrence Hill was aware that one of the engines had no brakes, but he never informed Frank of this fact. He assumed that the dispatcher who sent for the 2 additional locomotives would have passed that information along to Frank, but that didn't happen either. Nobody told Frank. So he was under the impression that he had 2 engines up front with fully functioning brakes and one with sporadically functioning brakes, as well as 2 engines in the back with fully functioning brakes. Again, this was more than enough braking power to keep the freight train at a safe speed all the way down the Cajon Pass based on the information that Frank had in his paperwork. When they were beginning the downgrade and beginning to pick up speed rather than slowing down, Frank called back to Lawrence and asked him if his dynamic brakes were applied, and he said that they were, but he again never mentioned that only one of the engines had functioning dynamic brakes. He knew only one of the engines had functioning brakes, but Frank believed both rear engines did. He isn't anywhere close to having the braking power that he assumed that he had and desperately needed. This is why he was confused as to why the train wouldn't slow down. There was one more thing that went wrong with the brakes that the NTSB discovered through the data recorders. Remember when Lawrence, the rear helper engineer, realized that something was going wrong, that there was a problem with the 4 front engines because they were picking up too much speed on the downgrade, and then he went and pulled the emergency brakes? Well, when he did this, I told you that it caused the train to momentarily slow, and then the train resumed picking up speed. When he pulled the emergency brake, the dynamic brake was automatically canceled out. This is a safety feature on train engines that helps to prevent its wheels from becoming locked, which will cause it to slide down the tracks. So with Frank up front putting full pressure on the air brakes and the intense heat from the friction causing those brakes to melt and fail, the dynamic brakes in the one engine in the rear that were functioning, being the only thing helping to slow the train down, getting canceled, Lawrence applying the emergency brakes actually caused the train to speed up even more. However, based on the paperwork that Frank Holland was given at the rail yard and the cargo that they were hauling, we said at the beginning it totaled 7.7 million pounds or 3.5 million kilos of cargo. Frank should have been able to maintain his speed going down the mountain pass even with all of the non-functioning engines and useless brakes. He should have had enough braking power to hold his speed. So, what went wrong? In order to figure this out, investigators needed to back up and take a look at the days leading up to this fateful trip. At the Mojave Rail Yard back on Saturday, May 6, 1989, 6 days before the trip, Southern Pacific number 7551 East had been pulling a shipment for a company called the Lake Minerals Corporation. Their company mined the trona at Owens Lake, one of the 2 trona mines that I mentioned earlier in the episode. They contracted Southern Pacific to have the trona shipped from their main facility located in Rosamond, California, to the Colton terminal, which would ultimately end up in the port of Los Angeles and shipped off to South America. A superintendent from the Lakes Mineral Corporation dropped off the paperwork for their cargo with Southern Pacific Railroad employee Thomas Blair. The paperwork was supposed to indicate what was inside the shipment and how much it weighed. However, for whatever reasons, the weight of this shipment of trona was not filled in on the paperwork. Lake Minerals Corporation believed that each of the rail cars was filled to its maximum capacity, which was 200,000 pounds or 90,000 kilos. Since that is what they expected the weight to be, the Lake Minerals superintendent did not feel it was necessary to write the numbers down on the paperwork. But Thomas Blair needed those numbers in order to input the information into the computerized forms. He has to have a weight listed, otherwise the train will not be able to leave the rail yard. Thomas Blair had been an employee with Southern Pacific for 17 years and had seen thousands upon thousands of freight cars come and go from the Mojave Rail Yard that he works at. So, using his experience, he decided to guesstimate that the cargo being carried on each of the freight cars weighed 120,000 pounds or 54,000 kilos. But that estimate, that guess, was way off. Tragically off. Millions of pounds and kilos off. Let's do the math. Thomas Blair's guess was 80,000 pounds or 36,000 kilos off each freight car, and there were a total of 69 of them. Based on the paperwork Thomas Blair gave to engineer Frank Holland, Frank believed that he was hauling 8,280,000 pounds or 3,726,000 kilos of cargo, when in reality, he's hauling 13,800,000 pounds or 6,210,000 kilos. So Frank is hauling more than 5.5 million pounds or nearly 2.5 million kilos more than he thinks he's hauling. Thomas's guess was nearly 40% less than the cargo's actual weight. Frank arranged for the number of locomotives based on the underestimated weight of the cargo. Even with some of the engine's brakes not working properly, he was confident, based on the information that he was given, that he had enough to maintain his downhill speed. This train was doomed before it even started going. Even if all 6 of the locomotive engine's brakes were fully functioning, it still would have been a harrowing journey down the mountain. And like just about every disaster caused by human error is preventable, so was the Southern Pacific San Bernardino train disaster. And not surprisingly, the ruptured pipeline explosion was preventable as well. Investigators knew immediately as soon as the pipeline exploded that this event was directly related to the train derailment 13 days earlier. There was no question. The rupture had occurred directly below where the train had crashed, about 2 meters or 6 feet below ground. If you recall, I said that CalNev pipeline employees cleared the trona from where the pipeline ran on their own with shovels and dug down to the pipe to examine it. They did not find any cracks or dents anywhere along the area where the train had derailed, nor did it seem that any portion of it had been weakened or compromised by the train crash. CalNev Pipeline ultimately determined that the pipe was safe for fuel to begin flowing through it once again. They monitored the pressure in the pipe when the gas was pumping through it, and there were no fluctuations that would indicate that gas was leaking anywhere along this pipeline. The fuel was pumping at 1600 psi, which is about what the average pressure washer is used at. Pressure checks at various places along the pipeline remained steady and normal, so the NTSB did come to the conclusion that the derailment itself was not the cause of the pipeline rupture. It was something else. So investigators looked elsewhere for clues as to what may have caused it. Despite the fact that the fire burned for 7 hours as gas spewed out of the pipe, that section of pipe that ruptured was not consumed or destroyed by the fire. It was brought into the lab to be examined closely. According to investigators, when the pipe burst, the shape of the opening of this rupture can be best described as looking like an open fish's mouth. The hole in the pipe was approximately 30 inches or 76 centimeters long, and at its widest, it was no more than 4 inches or 10 centimeters. When lab technicians examined the section of broken pipe, they noticed that there were some dents and deep gouges that ran long ways, sort of parallel to the bursted opening. And similar to the same types of analysis that are done with ballistics and tool mark comparisons, they needed to figure out exactly what caused these gouges and dents. Within the gouges, investigators found remnants of hardened steel that had been left behind that were transferred when whatever it was that caused the damage struck the pipe. And they could also tell that whatever it was that hit the pipe that left those marks and hardened steel deposits had teeth. There were several pieces of heavy machinery and equipment used at the site of the derailment during the cleanup effort that had hardened steel teeth, including several front end loaders and one large backhoe. However, the NTSB was never able to pinpoint exactly which piece of equipment caused the damage to the pipe. They were able to determine that it either happened while the railroad cars were being removed from the crash site or when the trona was being cleared out. While precautions had been taken to keep the heavy equipment away from the pipeline, not only was it not enough for the pipe to not be damaged during the cleanup, it also seemed to have either happened after CalNev employees inspected the pipe and found no damage, or they inadvertently overlooked the dents and gouges caused by the heavy equipment. Even though the cause of each disaster could be narrowed down to one human error each, the fact is there were a series of things, a chain of events that contributed to each of these catastrophes. When it came to the derailment, the dynamic brakes were working on only 3 out of the 6 locomotives, possibly even only 2. There was a lack of communication between the head engineer and the helper engineer, particularly when it came to the brakes. The practice of estimating weights of the freight cars by yard clerks in order to satisfy a computer system requirement created a hazardous situation. The yard clerk did not indicate on his paperwork that the weights he listed were estimates, and the failure to do so led to the wrong information being entered into the computer system. The tonnage profile generated by the computer system and given to the lead engineer contained the incorrect and underestimated weight. The head engineer accepted the information as accurate, and this was reasonable on his part. Based on the actual weight of the freight, the available dynamic brakes on the 6 engines, and Southern Pacific's operating guidelines, Southern Pacific train number 7551 East should not have been permitted to operate down the 2.2% downgrade. Even if the engineer would have been able to recover the use of the dynamic brakes, It would not have been enough to prevent the accident as it entered the 4-degree curve in the tracks where it derailed. The helper engineer failed to convey accurate information to the lead engineer regarding the status of the dynamic brakes in the helper engines. Crew members were not trained or instructed on working as a team and to communicate sufficiently in order to arrive at the most suitable solution to the emergency at hand. Updating the computer system with information regarding defective locomotive conditions did not receive priority attention in the dispatcher's office, and the responsibility for doing so had not been clearly delegated. Engineers had not been adequately prepared for handling a train in the event of an emergency. Oversight of train operations on mountain grades was inadequate. When it came to the pipeline, the 6 feet or 2 meters of earth that covered it was enough to protect it from the derailment. Both CalNev and Southern Pacific's supervision of the excavating equipment was insufficient to prevent damage to the pipe. The pipe was dented and gouged in several locations by earth-moving equipment. The pipeline was most likely damaged during the train wreckage removal operations or during the removal of the trona. CalNev returned the pipeline to service without adequately inspecting or testing it for damage. The pipeline experienced an overstress on May 25, 1989, when a pre-existing microfissure grew in size as the normal operation of the pipeline subjected the damaged metal to large operating stress. Pipeline safety requirements for liquid pipelines do not properly protect public safety because they do not contain adequate requirements for the rapid detection and shutdown of failed pipelines. The City of San Bernardino did not address the hazard posed by the proximity of the mainline railroads and of high-pressure pipelines. The deputy fire chief, despite being assured by CalNev that the pipeline was safe, did not exercise his authority as incident commander to have his concerns regarding the integrity of the pipeline addressed. So it was 2 unquestionably preventable disasters that cost 6 lives and forever changed the residents on Duffy Street and the surrounding areas. CalNev failed to inspect the pipeline thoroughly, particularly after the cleanup effort was completed. All lawsuits filed against the company were settled out of court. The only other accident along the pipeline occurred on December 22, 1980, when the pipeline carrying jet fuel ruptured about a mile west of Las Vegas Boulevard on Tropicana. It spilled fuel for 2 hours and eventually ignited. Nobody was killed, 1 firefighter was injured, and the cause was believed to be due to previous construction in the area of causing damage to the pipeline. Engineer Frank Holland was cleared of any wrongdoing by the NTSB, finding that all of his actions were reasonable based on the information that he was given. Frank continued working the railways, but he never made the trip down the Cajon Mountain Pass ever again. And that, my dreamers, was the tale of the Duffy Street catastrophes. I will share some pictures of the scene of the 2 accidents on social media once this episode goes live. To see those, go over to Facebook and like and follow California Dreaming's Facebook page and request to join the discussion group. I have a feeling some of you listening may have remembered these accidents or possibly even lived close by when they occurred, so I would love it if you would come and share your personal stories there. You can follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. Don't forget to check out Patreon. The very first part of our 8-part series on the mysterious death of Morgan Ingram is still unlocked for everybody to take a listen to and get a sample of what's going on over at our Patreon. Those episodes are entitled The Only Way Out, and it is a deep dive in uncovering the truth about what really happened the night that Morgan died of an amitriptyline overdose. Even if you're familiar with the story, I think you'll be in for many surprises in that series. So check that out. I want to thank you all again for listening to the show. I'm your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams.